From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and here's what's ahead. First half hour, the dicamba story. K-State's Sarah Lancaster will talk about herbicide alternatives to those 3 dicamba products whose registrations were recently vacated by a court ruling. She'll cover in full the herbicide options for application to dicamba-tolerant soybeans and cotton. Then we've invited in from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen, a day early. Roger brings us the just-announced position of the Environmental Protection Agency regarding farmers' use of those 3 dicamba products that they have on hand. And later, K-State's Charlie Lee on the research on multiple types of coronavirus carried by wildlife. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Agriculture Today. It's been very much a headliner in recent days. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco rendered a decision that, in essence, vacates the registration of 3 specific dicamba herbicide products as over-the-top treatments on dicamba-resistant crops, namely soybeans and cotton. This decision was in response to a lawsuit filed back in 2017, which said the EPA understated the risks of using these products. Now, we will get into the nuances of that decision. And as a matter of fact, the Environmental Protection Agency, very late yesterday, did put forth some guidance on the use of these products for the remainder of the growing season. And again, we'll line that out further on in the broadcast. But one thing is for certain, this decision came suddenly, unexpectedly, and has caused quite a stir in crop production circles in that there's more than a fair amount of acreage planted in Kansas and elsewhere to dicamba-resistant crop technology. So what can a producer do if, in fact, these dicamba applications aren't available to the individual? We'll talk that over today with Sarah Lancaster, Weed Management Specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Sarah, this rather came out of the blue, and it has caused some heartburn, hasn't it?
It's caused more than a small amount of heartburn, Eric. The timing of this announcement could hardly have been worse for farmers.
And you say that with good reason, because applications of this nature would be likely going on in the immediate weeks ahead, would they not?
That's right, Eric. We're in a time where the majority of soybeans in the state have been planted. And so farmers, with the recent rains and warm temperatures, they're really thinking hard about those post-emergent herbicide applications. And now is the time to be doing those. We have to stay ahead of things like pigweeds and such. So, yeah, the timing, like I said, just really couldn't be worse.
We don't know what the future holds for the availability of these dicamba products, and we probably should note them by name: Ingenia, Fexapan, and Extendamax. And time will tell. After we visit with you, we'll talk more about the legalities of this and the decision itself with an agricultural law specialist. We bring you in to cover the alternatives if, in fact, a producer is forced to go in another direction with their weed control here. First of all, what does a producer need to consider as they select from what's out there?
Okay, Eric. So the first thing, if I'm a producer and I have dicamba-resistant soybeans in my ground, the first thing I'm going to try to do is get a hold of a product called Tavium. You mentioned that Ingenia, Fexapan, and Extendamax are the 3 formulations that are in question here, but Tavium was not part of the lawsuit, most likely because it hadn't been labeled yet when the lawsuit was initiated. So Tavium is a premix of 2 products. It's dicamba and dual. So it's, one of those great products we talk about using our residual herbicides in a post-emergent application. So it's intended to help producers in that way. So Tavium is still on the table, no questions about using that. So that is probably the first option that farmers should be looking at, Eric.
But as we look at the information that you put out on this very subject in the e-update last Friday, if one is going to opt in that direction, they're going to have to be paying close attention to the application time quite soon, right?
Absolutely. So the application window for Tavium is limited to the V4 growth stage or before. So farmers will have to act particularly quickly with those applications.
But if for some reason that product would not be available or a producer wishes to go another way, there are other possibilities here, non-dicamba compounds that they could look at, correct?
That's right, Eric. So, we have to go back to our pre-dicamba and really our pre-glyphosate weed control practices here. So we're going to be thinking about those group 15 herbicides. You might know them as PPO inhibitors, or some folks will call them burners. So these are going to be products like fomesafen is the active ingredient in things like Reflex, FlexStar, and Prefix, which is another one of those premixes that includes fomesafen and metolachlor. Other examples would be things like Cobra, or things like Ultra Blazer would also be in that group 14 or PPO inhibiting family. So there are some populations of our major weeds like Palmer that are resistant to these, but resistance to the PPO inhibitors is not as widespread as resistance to the ALS inhibitors. So, at one point the ALS inhibitors would have been our go-to for weed control in soybeans. But because of that, and because of the nature of those products, we have a lot of cases of herbicide resistance to both those ALS inhibiting herbicides and glyphosate in our pigweed populations across the state.
So once more, Group 14 herbicide products are candidates here, as well as some Group 15 products?
Right. So, one of the most important recommendations for managing herbicide-resistant weeds is to use pre-emergent herbicides. The weed science industry as a whole has kind of adopted the tagline, start clean, stay clean. I tell producers my favorite pigweed is the one I never see.
Right.
So use those Group 15 products in your post-emergent herbicide application. So those are going to be things like acetochlor or Warrant, perhaps metolachlor or Dual or dimethenamide, which is Outlook. So any products that contain those herbicides would be good candidates to include in your post-emergent herbicide applications, just to help reduce those populations.
With any of those options, are there any worries about crop injury at all, Sarah?
So those PPO inhibiting herbicides are definitely associated with some crop injury. In general, we say that injury is primarily cosmetic. It's not going to be yield reducing, but with those PPO inhibiting herbicide applications, Reflex and Cobra, you should be looking for anticipating some crop injury there, some leaf burn, and bronzing is the jargon that we use to describe that injury.
But that injury may not be yield afflicting to any great extent. Is it more cosmetic?
Right. In general, we assume that injury is not going to cause yield reductions. It's just going to be cosmetic.
So with respect to any of these products, Sarah, are there any worries at all about rotation to the next crop following either soybeans or cotton?
There sure are, Eric. So particularly with things like Reflex, FlexStar, Prefix, that fomesafen component actually has a 10-month rotation restriction or rotation interval for corn. So you'll want to watch the timing of that post-emergent application if you decide to go with that product so that you don't affect your corn planting next year. In addition, those products also have some geographic restrictions. So Highway 281 is sort of the dividing line for some of those geographic restrictions.
And there's another attribute of dicamba, and that is its residual activity. If one wants to account for that, is that something they'd factor into their alternative product choice here?
Absolutely. That's where some of these Group 15 products come in, is kind of replacing that residual activity. So in addition to that, it's just good, smart weed management in terms of managing herbicide-resistant weeds and thinking about perhaps having to use less effective post-emergent herbicides. So lots of reasons to include those soil-active products in your post-emergent applications, Eric, and this just really highlights some of that.
All right. So how one might consider all that you've shared with us here today, Sarah? Yes, we know a little more about the availability of Ingenia, Fexapan, and Extendamax now than we did 24 hours ago. And again, we'll get into that in just a moment. But these alternatives could be chalked up as a plan B, as it were.
That's right. So, the Kansas Department of Agriculture has taken the position that they are not going to change the way they're enforcing the labels for these 3 dicamba products. So the same restrictions apply that you would have anticipated before the announcement last week. The same procedure for investigating drift complaints is still on the books, but that could change at any moment with another announcement.
Producers take advantage of what Sarah has put together with details on each of these other substitute products potentially for dicamba. It's in the Agronomy e-Update newsletter this past Friday, June the 5th. That's at agronomy.ksu.edu. And as always, you can reference as well the Chemical Weed Control Guide out of K-State, the 2020 edition there. So, Sarah, it's provided yet another interesting turn of events in what's been an interesting year anyway. So thank you for clarifying and sharing this information. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Eric.
She's Sarah Lancaster, a weed management specialist with K-State Research and Extension. In a moment, that other angle on this dicamba herbicide issue, and that is what the courts actually decided in regard to the registration of those products and how the EPA has now responded, an important message for you producers. Our next guest will sort it all out for us here on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today. Now to the latest on the legal status of those 3 dicamba herbicides that have been at the center of the anxiety over their availability in recent days. Per that court ruling that took place last week, there is now clarification on those products, and we're turning to a professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law to pass along the very newest developments here. Roger McEowen, we've moved him up one day to address this news. Roger, and before we talk of that, you might quickly here go over the timeline of events that led to the ruling here by one of your favorite judicial bodies.
Well, that's an interesting way to put it. You're referring to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit.
Right.
But back in 2015, the Obama administration's USDA deregulated dicamba-tolerant soybean and cotton seeds under the Plant Patent Act. And at that point, Monsanto began to sell the dicamba-tolerant seeds in advance of the 2016 growing season. So that was done, however, before EPA had approved the companion dicamba herbicides for over-the-top use. In 2016, and of course that's what sets up a problem, in 2016 about 1.7 million acres of dicamba-tolerant soybeans and 50,000 acres of dicamba-tolerant cotton were planted. Those numbers grew dramatically over the next couple of years, but that was the start in 2016. Now, the prior versions of dicamba herbicides, which were out at that point in time, because, again, EPA had not approved the companion dicamba herbicides for these new seeds. So the old herbicides could not legally be used on the emergent dicamba-tolerant crops, but some farmers applied the older, more volatile versions to those crops. In the fall of 16, then the EPA announced that it would grant a 2-year conditional registration for 3 lower volatility over-the-top dicamba herbicides. That's Monsanto's XtendiMax, DuPont's Fexapan, and BASF's Ingenia products. So you had 3 different companies, and those registrations allowed the use of the associated herbicides for the dicamba-tolerant crops in 34 states. Now, through the 2017 growing season, we started to get complaints of alleged dicamba caused damage to commercial crops and other plants, and that seemed to increase as we went through the growing season. So now Bayer Monsanto proposed label changes to XtendiMax for use during the 2018 growing season to address that off-site drift. The EPA approved the additional label restrictions to the over-the-top dicamba products for the 2018 growing season, and then in late 18, the EPA granted conditional extensions to the 2016 registrations for 2 more years, which would take us to the end of this year. Now, while that was all going on, we had a coalition of farm groups and various environmental activist groups that sued the EPA and wanting a review of the 2016 registration decision by EPA for XtendiMax. They then amended that petition to include those 2017 label amendments. That case was ultimately dismissed because the court never got around to hearing it until the 2016 registrations were renewed in late 18 through 2020. So they refiled, and the timing of this is interesting. They refiled in the Ninth Circuit out in San Francisco in January of 19. The court didn't hear the case challenging these registrations. There was no oral argument until late April of this year. 15 months went by before they heard the case. And then they just decided it, canceling the registrations last week. And that's what has hit the press and what we're talking about now. I find the timing of that rather troubling. Mm-hmm. The court had this case in front of them as of January of 19. And knew that this was a time-sensitive matter, that farmers would be purchasing these products in a package deal, the seeds and the accompanying herbicides, and they'd be paying a hefty tech fee to get all of this in either late 19 or very early 2020 for use in the 2020 growing season. This case needed to be heard in the summer or fall of 19. That could be 8, 9, 10 months after they got the case, with a decision rendered shortly thereafter, say very early in 2020 or late 19, and farmers would have known where they stood before they made these decisions to what seeds they were going to use to plant soybeans and cotton. But the Ninth Circuit delayed, and hence we got the decision at probably the absolute worst time during the growing season. We got it on June 3rd.
So last Wednesday, the individual states, though, weren't sure where to go with that, and they essentially responded in varying ways around the country.
Yep. What the Ninth Circuit did was issue what's called a vacatur. They vacated the registrations, basically canceling them, and making, therefore, the registrations invalid. And so that raised the question as to whether existing supplies that farmers had on hand could be used. And some states said no, some states said yes. State of Kansas didn't take an official position as of last night, but they said go ahead, informally, go ahead and do what you need to do. Go ahead and use the existing supplies that you have. That's what EPA was addressing last night.
Exactly what has the Environmental Protection Agency decided in this situation?
Several things, and this is really important. And I wrote a piece on this last Saturday, and my argument was that it's probably time for the EPA to tell the Ninth Circuit to go pound sand in terms of trying to impose their decision outside the states within the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit's out in California, and so it covers Hawaii and Alaska and some of the western states, including Arizona. And Arizona, by the way, is the only state in those 34 states where these dicamba products can be utilized. So if the decision is just restricted to the Ninth Circuit states over which the Ninth Circuit has jurisdiction, then only Arizona is involved, and I don't think there's a whole lot of soybean or cotton production in the state of Arizona. And so the impact of the decision would be severely limited. And so I was arguing that EPA, by various means here, from the Administrative Procedures Act and what the IRS has done, I was arguing there were ways to limit the EPA to limit the impact of the court's decision to just those states in the Ninth Circuit. The EPA got there but by a different route. And they said, look, when a registration is canceled, we reserve the right, the EPA said, to regulate distribution and use of existing supplies. But what they said, a very clever argument, they said that when the court makes a product illegal, what they're doing is making the sale and movement of that product illegal. So that's important to the manufacturers and the distributors. But they said the court did not make the use of the product illegal under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act. That's the way the law reads. Use is not made illegal when the registration is canceled. Then it's up to the EPA to deal with this issue. And what they said was, court, what you did was you just made a registered product, herbicide, unregistered. There's no corresponding provision in FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act, that prohibits use of unregistered pesticides. So now when you took registered and you made it unregistered by your vacating the registrations, there's no provision in the law that prohibits use of that, and there's no provision that requires that unregistered chemicals be used according to their labels. So what the EPA is saying here is that products can still be used. They can't be sold, they can't be moved, but if they're already on the farm, in existing stock, they can be used, and now they don't have to be used in accordance with the label. So EPA said, we've got to come in here and deal with this and give instructions to farmers as to what to do, and basically tell them to follow labels, but they can use existing stocks, and the EPA said you have until the end of July to use your existing supplies of these three types of chemicals. Well, you take it to the end of July, the problem's over. These chemicals will not be utilized, at least around here, probably not past the 4th of July, let alone the end of July. So they really solved the problem. They got to the same conclusion that I got, the same result that I was pushing for, but they went a different path to get there.
So just to be clear for producers, practically speaking, this is the green light for producers to use those products as they have them on hand.
Absolutely. That's exactly what the EPA said.
Right. Before we let you go, Roger, the ruling is still out there. Where might this go from here with respect to those three individual compounds?
Well, what's going to happen here is that the EPA is going to go back and they're going to make an evaluation of the products in accordance with the way that the court said they needed to, weighing the cost and the benefits and the societal factors and so forth. So they will do that. And there'll probably be another registration that is approved down the line, and that may be challenged. However, I think before we get there, what's going to happen is that the marketplace is going to take care of this. As I mentioned earlier, the dicamba-related products, they come with a lot of use restrictions and recommendations on the label. That label, as the court indicated, is 40 pages long for some of these products. And I've had some farmers tell me that, kind of tongue-in-cheek, they said, well, I need a PhD just to be able to read the label to properly apply it. And that's a problem. I think naturally farmers will migrate to another choice that's easier to use and may be more effective to deal with these increased number of acres that have these traits on them, the dicamba-tolerant traits, but we shall see.
Well, this has been an interesting episode of late with the ruling, with the EPA response. At least there is some level of clarity for producers to go with now, and that's good news indeed. Roger, as always, thanks for taking the time to share the insight on all of this, and we'll touch base in a couple of weeks once more.
Thank you, Eric.
He's a professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. Roger McEowen with us on this part of Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Now in our 96th year of broadcast service to agriculture in Kansas and the Central Plains, this is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Well, this week's Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report has been posted by the USDA. As of this past Sunday, topsoil moisture supplies in Kansas, 4% surplus, 58% adequate, 38% short to very short. Subsoil moisture at 3% surplus, 65% adequate, and 32% short to very short. The condition of the winter wheat crop, 42% good to excellent, 34% fair, that is, and 24% poor to very poor. The coloring of the wheat, 61% now. That's near the average, and wheat reaching maturity is now at 4%, but no official report of harvest activity as of yet. The condition of the Kansas corn crop, 60% good to excellent, 33% fair, 7% poor to very poor. Corn emerging now at 86%. That's very near the average. And the soybean crop condition in the state then is at 67% good to excellent, 31% fair, only 2% poor to very poor. Planting is 79% complete now, well ahead of the average of 55% for the date. And soybean emergence at 59%, again, well ahead of the 37% average. Grain sorghum condition, 52% good to excellent, 43% fair, and 5% poor to very poor. Sorghum planting is 51% done now, well ahead of the 37% average. And range and pasture conditions around Kansas this week, 55% good to excellent, 34% fair, and 11% poor to very poor. For the update on corn and soybean conditions nationally now, here's the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says conditions for the nation's corn and soybean crops are much better than last year.
Our second week of reporting for the condition showing 75% good to excellent. That is up 1 point from last week. And we're steady at 4% very poor to poor.
This compares to last year's corn condition at this time of 59% good to excellent and 9% very poor to poor. Meanwhile, corn planting is at 97% nationwide, while 89% of the corn has emerged.
As we move to soybeans, very similar picture. It was kind of a greenhouse-like week, very warm, plenty of moisture around for the most part.
86% of the soybeans were planted, while 67% had emerged. With condition
improving slightly from last week, we are at 72% good to excellent, up 2 points from a week ago. Steady at 4%, very poor to poor.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And again, nationally, 85% of winter wheat had headed at the end of last week, compared with the 5-year average of 88%. Winter wheat harvest moving ahead only 4% last week, now 7% done as of Sunday. That equals the average pace. Winter wheat conditions nationally holding steady last week at 51% good to excellent. The current good to excellent rating is below last year's 64%. Well, on we go now to this week's edition of Milk Lines for you dairy producers. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike.
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the control of flies on our dairy farms during the summer season. As we approach summer, and I know many of you have been battling flies for weeks now, I think it's important that we take a close look at, well, maybe just the life cycle of the fly and then try to understand just how quickly they actually do produce on our farms. So if you look at something like the common housefly, those insects usually only live for about 15 to 25 days. The females during that time will probably lay eggs about every 3 to 4 days, and they will lay about 75 to 150 eggs at a time. The total life cycle from egg to adult is usually about 7 to 10 days during the summertime. Some scientists have actually done some calculations to determine, so just, one pair of breeding flies that start out in April, how many young ones can be produced during the total summer season. Well, according to their calculations, a single pair of breeding flies that started in April, you count all of the descendants from those two, by August might reach as many as 191 trillion. Yes, that's 191 trillion with a T by August. So you can see how your dairy farm can be quickly overrun by flies just because of their ability to reproduce. So what are you going to do as a dairy farmer? I know many of you are probably already spraying, and that's a great way to knock down the adult flies. But keep in mind that if we have adult flies, that means we also probably have eggs around the farm that are in various stages of developing. And if they're in various stages of developing, we'll see more flies emerge in about 7 to 10 days, even though we've knocked flies down. And in fact, you might spray today, and tomorrow you might see a new crop of flies. Those are the ones that hatched in the last 24 hours since we did our initial spraying. So it is a continual battle that we fight all summer. Sprays are an important part of that, but they're not just the total answer. As we think about fly control, one of the main things we really need to do is simply sanitation, removing the fly breeding areas that we might have on our farm. This includes things like manure, rotting feed, weeds around our facility. Those things need to be kept under control so that we limit the amount of breeding area that might be available. For some of you that are distanced from other operations, using larvicides starting early in the fly season might be a method of control. In general, these are most effective when we have at least 1 mile between us and another livestock operation. And if it's going to be effective, the larvicide would be needed to be used in all of the animals that are on our farm. If we do not have those sorts of situations, we're largely dependent on things like insecticides, maybe biological control early in the season, but likely that's going to be overwhelmed before the season is over. We'll have to resort to larvicides, and sometimes we'll also have to incorporate some other methods of control, such as baits and traps, to keep the fly population under control the entire summer. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to take action against fly control early and be diligent through the entire summer season.
Thanks, Mike. A quick calendar item here. The Women Managing the Farm program based here at K-State will be hosting a free webinar a week from tomorrow, June the 17th, to look at the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on U.S. and global agricultural economies. The featured presenter there, renowned Virginia Tech agricultural economist David Cole. You can find out more at the Women Managing the Farm website. This is Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Agriculture Today is back, and it's our weekly wildlife segment for you now with Charlie Lee, wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Well, this has been cast into the limelight, obviously, over the last several months, Charlie, and that is coronavirus and its relationship with wildlife. We're, of course, talking about COVID-19, but it's important to point out that coronaviruses have been present in wildlife for a long, long while.
Yes, there was a publication in the journal Nature in 2017 that states the majority of human emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, and that those viruses that originate in wild mammals are of particular concern. Some of those would include diseases like HIV, Ebola, SARS, and we do know that with the disease COVID-19, which emerged in the Chinese city of Wuhan in December 2019, that virus rapidly spread across China, across the world. Although the research continues, it is suspected that that virus may have originated at a wildlife market. Subsequent research has suggested that the virus may have jumped from bats to pangolins, since pangolins were found in recent studies to harbor similar coronaviruses. But perhaps it also involved another intermediate host before it reached humans. We do know that the word coronavirus has been attached to this latest outbreak. COVID-19 is just one of hundreds of viruses within the coronavirus family. Viruses are fairly common in mammals and birds, although they don't always cause disease in those species. They often never reach humans. When they do, sometimes those results are deadly, such as past epidemics of severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, which was identified in 2003, and then MERS, or Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which occurred in 2012. All three of the coronaviruses appear to be similar to the coronaviruses in bats. So that raises suspicion that the flying mammals have played a role in transmitting them.
Why would bats be more prone than other mammals to serve as a reservoir for a coronavirus then?
Well, it's been suspected that it has to do with their unusually fortified immune systems. A bat's ability to fly results in a need for a high metabolism, a strong immune system, because they spend on these nightly forays a extremely large amount of energy. That results in a lot of tissue damage to their flight muscles. Then that animal would be vulnerable to sickness. But over millions of years, bats have evolved ways to tolerate this damage and develop resistance to viral infections. And other animal hosts don't have that same defense. And although bats are phylogenetically very distinct from humans, that still can be a blessing or a curse. But since they are so far removed from humans, oftentimes it requires another host species that would be closer phylogenetically to humans than bats.
And that species could be what?
Well, in this case, it could be the pangolins, which is an endangered species, one of the most widely trafficked species in Asia. Despite being an endangered species, they're known to host a number of coronaviruses that are similar to the ones that caused COVID-19. There's been some other work on other species, including civets, which are cat-like weasels, that have been linked in the SARS epidemic. But I think it really gets to how many different species are thrown together in these markets where live animals and perhaps seafood is sold. They bring animals together from a wide range of geographic areas, mix them in a conglomeration that doesn't happen in the wild, and perhaps in stressful, unsanitary conditions where they're kept makes them more susceptible to virus. Rodents are also around those wildlife markets. They certainly can carry coronaviruses. In China, Southeast Asia, communities have looked at wildlife trade as a way to improve their economic status. But I think probably some better regulation or enforcement of existing laws could certainly help on the illegal trade in endangered animals, and perhaps reduce some of the stress on these other animals that are used primarily for food.
So really, if there is a solution, and of course nothing easy is forthcoming here, but breaking that chain of traffic is about what we're left to as humans, because these viruses are likely to be in the wild in perpetuity.
Well, we know that we've had prehistoric hunter-gatherers killed and captured animals in small numbers from very isolated areas. Modern societies now capture large quantities of diverse species. They ship them all around the globe. Diseases, once they're established, are pretty difficult to get rid of. Even if wildlife markets are the problem, I think there are other possible transmission avenues out there, and one of those is that we're starting to move into areas around the globe where we've not had people before. So we're putting humans into populations that are much more remote and putting pressure on wildlife in those locations. Then those species are shipped around, and I think all of this mixing and ease of travel certainly leads to these zoonotic outbreaks.
So in the end, we as a society need to look at contact with wildlife and trying to minimize that as much as possible.
It's always wise to minimize contact with wildlife. I know people like to get up and observe wildlife in close proximity. There's a saying that we like to keep wildlife wild, and I think that's a very important thing to learn from COVID-19.
Well, it's a long-standing connection, coronavirus in its many manifestations and wildlife, and brought to the surface by the COVID-19 situation. And Charlie, good background. We appreciate you sharing that with us. Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, that's Charlie Lee. And our time is away once again. Thanks for tuning in. Please rejoin us right here tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.